Hello and welcome back to the AI Ethics Now podcast. My name is Tom Ritchie and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Sanjay Sharma. Hi Sanjay.
Hi, Tom. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, amazing to meet you. How are you doing? You okay?
I'm fine. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks.
Good. I wonder, Sanjay, if you could tell us a little bit more about your current role and what brings you to this discussion on AI, please.
Okay, thanks. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to the podcast. Really exciting to be part of this module. So, I'm a lecturer researcher at the Centre for Interdisciplinary Methodologies, a bit of a mouthful. We call it SIM for short. And one of my areas of interest is concerning digital technology and inequalities. And it's almost impossible if you've researched that area to avoid the impact of artificial intelligence. So, hence, I think that's one of the reasons why you've invited me. I'm particularly interested in thinking about how we think about AI ethics, how ethics is increasingly becoming a point of discussion, but sometimes it's skewed, particularly by the corporate influence over the development and design of AI. That's one of my other areas of interest. And uh, I've been involved in a couple of research projects which are quite relevant. One was around AI or digital technology for the idea of social good. So there's increasing critiques of technology, but it's kind of harder to say, well, how can it actually benefit people, particularly marginalized groups in that sense? Another area is can we reimagine AI from different sets of ethical values which aren't necessarily aligned with, say, corporate interests of profit or optimization, for instance. So that's something I think I'll talk about a little bit more today because I think it's something which where I think we really need to start thinking about, okay, this technology is rolling out, but do we need to slow it down? Do we need to think about what value systems it's reproducing?
Amazing. And I think that's exactly in line with where we are on the module currently, particularly talking around kind of corporate influence and how do we ensure that AI is something that is for the good of all humanity, not just perhaps those in the West or those, as you say, in businesses and other entities. So, how do you think bias in AI systems perpetuates existing inequalities?
What I want to say about AI is essentially, I think it needs to be more understood as the application of machine learning algorithms, which are acting more autonomously and they're automating at scale. So, practices of classification, recommendation, and prediction. I think that if we start thinking about AI in those terms, we start then thinking about it more carefully as opposed to sort of the magical qualities of generative AI and ChatGPT, for instance. And if students haven't already come across this kind of literature, I'd really recommend them to look at the work of earlier work around critiques of algorithms, such as Victoria Eubank's work around automating inequality, Sapphire Noble's work of algorithms of oppression, and Rua Benjamin's work of race after technology. I think those three sets of books give you a really solid understanding of even contemporary issues now about AI. And it's just worth noting that when I started researching in this area, we were talking about algorithms. We weren't really talking about AI. And now we don't talk about algorithms much anymore. We talk about AI, which again, I think tends to mystify more than demystify. Okay, so slightly long-winded start to answering your question in terms of how does it perpetuate existing inequalities. I think one of the problems is that they have an ideology of what's been called techno-solutionism. So they essentially simplify complex social issues and kind of reframe them as technical problems. So this goes again, it's this idea that, to sort out crime, we don't really look at the causes of crime. We just look at let's build more prisons. It's that way of thinking about technology. So, but in a more complicated way, even because the solutions to inequalities, in my perspective, are social, economic, political. We might use technology as well to help us, but what's being foregrounded now is technology seems to be leading the solution. And I just think that's plain wrong. The other problem, how it's perpetuating existing inequalities, is that these systems are being embedded in already existing systems which perpetuate inequalities. So think about border control or immigration. What that's done is essentially increase the surveillance of marginalized groups. Or think about how AI has been put in criminal justice systems. And surprise, surprise, if you look at the research, it's tended to perpetuate these inequalities because of the biased data sets, for example, it's using. And when you look at, say, predictive policing, it's leading to the over policing of areas which are already over policed in the first place. So you're getting these kind of data-driven forms of discrimination where historical data is being used to inform future decisions, and they actually perpetuate past injustices. And in a more complex way, even when um, data which doesn't include race, for instance, or gender, or other sort of protected characteristics, often you have other proxy variables which do encode those inequalities, and they're quite hard to determine because these systems are very opaque, they're complicated. Uh, with the advancements of what's called neural networks and how they end up um, producing their outputs, we don't actually know. All we know is the inputs and outputs. So we're deploying systems where we don't quite know the effects of them until we actually use them. And however much corporations are trying to make AI systems safe, the fundamental problem is the original data sets, the way they've been scraped, are unsafe. So you've got a situation where you've collected, harvested huge amounts of data from all sorts of sources, which are impossible to check, and then you build a system, and then you try to fix it from the other side. So then one must wonder, are these systems designed in the right way? Maybe these systems are too ambitious trying to do too much. Generalized systems or universal systems rather than, say, narrow AI, which is, say, very good at spotting lung cancers, but it's not so great at determining policing and criminal justice. So I think we need to think about what these systems are being used for when we think about inequalities. Now, there's a whole other set of issues I could talk about if you want me to go on,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
and and that's think about AI in terms of the whole pipeline or the ecosystem it belongs to, and the work of Kate Crawford in a really interesting book called Atlas of AI is definitely worth looking at if you're interested in this. And I'll just rattle through a number of issues which she raises and a number of academics have raised. So when you think about the AI ecosystem, think about the resource extraction of the minerals that are used to build the chips. Even that, think about smartphones as well. And who benefits from those? And often it's the global south are exploited and environmental damage that's caused, and they don't benefit from the wealth generation. And it's increasingly talked about concerning energy consumption and climate impact of training AI models and running the data centers. Um, and again, the climate impact is often most felt in the global south. Also, we can think about data collection and labeling. It's become well known that data sets often underrepresent, exclude minoritized groups. I talked about trying to make AI systems safe. So the filtering or the moderation of the data sets. We've been using low paid labor from the global south in poor working conditions. Some of the people, it's been documented now, are traumatized by looking at this scraped data sets from all sorts of sources. Then there's a question of how algorithms themselves, the models, are developed, who develops them, the lack of diversity in the teams that develop them. Often they're developed with a kind of an invisible norm of whiteness as well. How that gets embedded in algorithmic design, just as much as whiteness is embedded in institutions. It's also embedded in algorithms, but it's difficult to unearth because of the very nature of the models and how they get developed. Again, it's something I could talk about. When it comes to AI, training AI models, the computational resources, they're concentrated in the global north, the wealthy corporate companies that require billions of dollars and pounds to do this. When they try to optimize the models, they tend to optimize the majority worldview. So just as something as for those students who've done some statistics and think about many AI models use the idea of regression, to fit data points to a line. And one of the fundamental problems of regression is it's not so good at outliers, the stuff that doesn't fit into the model. And if you think about marginalized groups, they don't fit into the model. So at the kind of very heart of how AI works, it's kind of discriminatory by design. It can't, you'd have to have a different way of thinking about AI if you don't want it to discriminate data points or outliers. The kinds of metrics that are used to evaluate AI, they often don't take account of equity concerns. They're an afterthought rather than being embedded right from the beginning. And I'll just finish off the question of regulation. It's way behind the speed of development of AI, and that's a real problem, and it's really difficult. AI are complex systems which we only really understand when we deploy them in the real world. So we're all being tested on AI. Every time you put a prompt in ChatGPT, every time Netflix gives you a recommendation, we're in a constant experiment, and we don't really know the outcomes yet of that. Final point, I want us to think about particularly the global south. Is AI kind of recreating or new forms of digital colonialism? And again, a number of authors are starting to discuss this.
No, fascinating. And I think you've raised so many interesting points, particularly around techno-solutionism, as well as techno-skepticism, as well as some of the challenges associated with that. You mentioned as well about the impact on the global south, and the way we've tried to frame that is the global south tends to be in a bit of a lose-lose situation when it comes to engaging with and using AI, because you obviously have the way that AI works using regression. Their voices, even if they are captured, then aren't even necessarily what's selected as part of the algorithm. And you mentioned as well in terms of neural networks, and you alluded to kind of the black boxing of AI, and that's something we're really keen for students to begin to question as well. Actually, how do we understand what's happening here? How can we test this in a way that doesn't lead to negative outcomes? There's so much to cover, but something I wanted to maybe pick up on from what you said is you mentioned about how these biases they're implicit in these systems, and I wonder if, do you think that's because those biases are perhaps implicit in us as a species, and we have stereotyping within us as a, dare I say, survival mechanism? Not in the context perhaps we understand stereotyping, but it helps our brain shortcut and make decisions on things. But I wonder if this entire discussion around AI is going to prompt us to take a more philosophical approach to understanding humanism and then post-humanism. So what do we understand ourselves to be in relation to AI? Because with AI being a reflection of us, because someone in another podcast, and it's been said elsewhere as well, but it's not artificial because we make it, and it's not intelligence in the way that we would define intelligence. And so I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on the post-humanist aspect.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a small point around the question of classification. To function as humans, we need to classify to make sense of the world, otherwise the boundaries are too fuzzy. But any kind of classification has a power dynamic. It excludes something. Now, when we automate classification at scale, we don't know what's going on in terms of how the classifications are operating, how patterns are being identified in these systems, particularly neural nets. So I think that's one of the problems of when we're giving up certain forms of decision making and understanding the world to AI systems, is that we're then kind of letting loose a particular way of understanding the world, through classification, through prediction, and supercharging it. And that becomes the way then the world starts unfolding itself. So when I think about technology, or when we think about technology, technology isn't something outside of us. We're part of, we've always been determined by technology or being influenced, and we've shaped technology. Technology shapes us. The moment we started throwing rocks at each other, that changed the nature of what we could do. So I'm not an anti-technologist, but I think the problem is AI amplifies certain practices of knowledge production, of prediction. And that's not, in terms of if we think about what our human qualities are, we're not just that, we're much more than that. But we're kind of giving up maybe other ways of being, all our diversity and differences, to certain kinds of roles of machinic thinking, which are narrowing the possibilities of how we live in the world.
And that machinic thinking, I think, is decided by the large companies that are developing and creating the boundaries within which their AI systems are working. So, yeah, there is that real question, not only about the governance around it, but actually who are we giving this up to? Are we happy with where these things are going? And if we think about some of the ethical challenges we know that are associated with some organizations that are already making some of these platforms, as you said, it's kind of being reinforced because we're giving up the part of ourselves perhaps to this process of developing these AI.
Yeah. I'd just like to add one more thing. It's interestingly so, some large cutting edge corporations now are working with universities to implement their generative AI systems and incorporate them into our how we do research, how we do admin, and how we teach. And one of the things, interestingly, they make the point of is if you don't integrate our tech, you'll be left behind. And I think so the worldview becomes, that corporate worldview becomes a dominant neoliberal corporate worldview, and I find that quite scary. I find that sort of threatening how our autonomy as a society, at societal level, at community level, at educational level, that our decision-making capacities become impeded, become less and less, and these automating systems um, aren't augmenting us, but are kind of more and more determining us. And I'm not talking about AI dystopias and taking over the world, etc., and destroying humanity. I'm talking about the everyday things we do and how that autonomy is being taken away from us.
And I think a really good example is one you used earlier. Just a really simple, practical example, I suppose, is when you get recommendations on Netflix, you're being, for want of a better term, railroaded to watching certain content because it says, "Oh, you like this, you've watched this, so I'm going to suggest this." And we're starting to see the same thing with social media platforms, with these echo chambers that are developing, and it's that kind of slow creep, I suppose, of where this is beginning to happen, even in the food you buy if you use an app to purchase food, through to lots of different aspects of your life, as you say, not the big scary dystopias where the Terminator's coming at you, but much more of the, dare I say, mundane day-to-day things. The AI is being used to simplify. Obviously, we gain a lot from using AI in some ways. I think personally, I benefit a lot from AI as a time-saving tool. I use it to help me ideate and develop thoughts. I use it to debate against if I'm trying to understand something and trying to understand my position on it, and it can be useful for that. But you've raised a really great point of, well, what are we giving up by doing that? But what steps do you think we can take to begin to address some of the biases we're seeing in AI development and deployment?
It's not easy to give a good answer here because I think it requires many things. Um, Partly, it relates to sort of wider structural aspects, um, a more fundamental way of rethinking how AI is developed and deployed, particularly given we have societies which are deeply unequal in all sorts of ways. if I was sort of put in a corner and said, okay, what can we do? I think one of the ways is, and we've read this already, but reframe the problem. First of all, is AI always appropriate solution? I think often it's not, and so we need to put some brakes on occasionally. Maybe we need to, because this technologies, as I mentioned, we only know its effects when we put it into the real world. So, and other people have talked about this. We need to have a much more of a slower AI rollout, a much more narrow AI. Only have it applied in particular domains rather than in this kind of generalist, universal way, which in some ways echoes the idea of the universalism of colonialism, for instance. We could think about aspects of participatory design. So, involve local communities or groups that are most affected by these systems, involve them in thinking about their design, their deployment. Um, does it help them? Is it a solution for them? So we can think about it rather than it being corporate design led. Now, in reality, that's not going to happen. But I think in terms of, we need to start that conversation about who is AI actually for. Um, I've been to many presentations from corporate actors, and they all talk about social benefits and social good. And this is the kind of, not the cynical part of me, but fundamentally, there's very little conversation going on about what is the social good in terms of, from a corporate worldview, compared to everyday life. Another area is, it's often talked about to diversify the teams of developers. I think that's certainly important. Um, but I think when we think about diversifying, I think it's more about broadening out, not just sort of who the techies are, but having other actors, other stakeholders involved from the very start in developing these models, in developing this tech, and again, and to questioning, well, do we need this? So, for instance, when you have an AI model that can essentially produce deep fakes very easily, um, what's the use case of that, and why would we want to do that? We seem to sort of be rolling out this technology because we can actually do it, and then think about the problems with it as an afterthought. So that whole kind of tech-led thing has to be flipped around. It has to be socially led rather than tech-led.
I really like your point about participatory design, and it makes me think about some principles of design thinking, which is focusing on empathizing with users and thinking more about how do you center the human when you're trying to solve a problem rather than creating a solution and then thinking about how it works for people. You understand the needs of people and create the solution for them. How do we ensure that what we're creating, what we're using, where we're using it, as you said, is suitable, is relevant, is helpful, doesn't have a sting in the tail, I would suppose, with certain AIs where we think we're getting a benefit, but perhaps it's taking away. You also said about the different actors. I think that's something we're trying to do on this module as well, which is not just have something for just computer scientists or just economists thinking about these sorts of things. We've tried to do something that all students can come together and actually rethink about. I'm a historian. I have a very different way of approaching the world than a philosopher would, than as I say, a computer scientist would. But actually, how can we bring those different ways of thinking about understanding the world to synthesize new ways of thinking about AI and talking about AI and being able to challenge in future careers?
In terms of how we're taught about technology, in many ways, we're not taught about technology. We just want technology to work. We pick up our phones. We don't really care about the innards of an iPhone or an Android phone. We don't care about the operating system. We might start becoming aware of questions of privacy and what kind of data is being collected about us. But essentially, we want to pick it up and make it work. And I think we pay a big price for that kind of opaqueness and convenience. And AI is actually making that, laying that more bare, because as I went back to my first point about, think about the whole ecosystem and the pipeline of AI, when you put it in that context, when ChatGPT gives me a great answer, I've kind of like made the world a little bit hotter. I've probably marginalised some poorer groups in the global south. Yeah, all those invisible things that technology hides from us. Um, and the ecological impact are huge. I think just recently came out that the companies themselves have underestimated their carbon emissions by 600%, which doesn't really surprise me because they're controlling the narrative. So yeah, I just think we're paying a very high price for using this tech, which on one level is amazing. It can do amazing things. Um, but I think we've got to the point where we've got to just one of the areas of research I'm interested in is one of abolitionism, which questions certain systems, doesn't just destroy them, but tries to then say, what else can we have in place? We need to start doing that with AI if we're going to prevent it from increasingly just becoming ubiquitous to the point where it becomes very difficult to regulate because it's so embedded in everything we do.
You've mentioned a lot, Sanjay, in your answers about the role of the individual, the role of businesses, and we've touched a little bit on the role of governments. But I wonder if we could try to take them all together and get your perspective on how individuals, businesses, and governments can work together to actually help shape this future of AI into something that is more positive.
Personally, I think that's quite difficult. If you look at historically the role of governments and how it's regulated technology, um, it hasn't done a great job. You've got huge monopolies that are formed, um, and let's take the example of Twitter or X. Um, okay, maybe it's going downhill at the moment, but in a way, it became at some point the kind of de facto space for public discussion. Politicians are on the platform. A lot of conversations, the way it feeds news and understanding of the world increasingly. Yeah, it's got a fairly, not a huge user base, but it's taken over the, the public sphere. So, should we have societies where corporate actors essentially determine public infrastructures? So I'd like to see if we're going to be successful to connect individuals with businesses and government. I think we need to have a different way of organizing the social where certain things are part of public infrastructure. And I actually think many AI systems should be as well. If we talk about the data commons, for instance, the majority of AI training data is our data. It's human data, but we don't own these systems, even though they're us. If you think about social media, they'd be empty without our posts. Okay, the corporate argument is we're giving you the infrastructure, we're spending the billions to do this. But then you think, well, you're already creating the rules of the game that we're having to fit in. So I think,
And they're only doing it because of what they get back.
yeah,
No one's doing this out of the goodness of their own heart. Yeah.
yeah, you're probably old enough to remember when Google started and they said, don't be evil. And then the business model changed to a form of what's called surveillance capitalism. And they know they're evil, but they just carry on because it makes them money. Okay, it's a bit of a crude argument, but essentially, I think, let's reimagine AI as a form of public infrastructure as opposed to a form of corporations making money.
It's a really interesting way to think about it. And as well, yes, that kind of nationalized approach or internationalized approach to it, I think is a way that we can start to have that conversation about a different future for AI.
I certainly think, uh, I mean, again, a brief thing. I mean, obviously, when we discuss these things, it's a moving playing field. But yeah, the EU AI bill at least it's a step forward to start thinking about how we might regulate this technology. What I fear is the speed of the technology, the obscurity of it, kind of defeats a lot of regulation. So the regulation can't be something, oh, we'll regulate them, we won't regulate again for 5 years and then 10 years, because within that space, you'd have all sorts of impacts of AI that we haven't predicted. I think that's it's one of my constant refrains, I guess, in this podcast is that we only know how AI works is when it's rolled out in real world situations. They can make it safe as much as they can, but they cannot test for everything. And humans, in terms of human interactive systems, we're smart. We like to hack things. We like to break things. And that's always possible with AI systems. And when it comes to, again, when it comes to deploying this in systems which are already kind of unjust, it doesn't matter how good the regulation is, it's still going to perpetuate those unjust systems. So I think regulation, governments can help so far, but I think it's a fundamental way of thinking about what is this technology for and what it is doing and who is it actually benefiting.
And I agree entirely with what you're saying, but I also think the next part of that sentence is, that it's almost incumbent on us as individuals to then play a more active role in that. We can't afford to trust this to someone else. We need to be part of it.
One of the problems with this technology is it's seductive. When you talk to an AI assistant, whether it's Siri or when you input a prompt into a generative AI system, it can come out with you know convincing answers. And I think we've got to step back and think, well, what's going on here? Uh, Not just the fact that it's because sometimes it can hallucinate or give false answers. It's a question of what what do we want this technology to actually be doing, and what kind of harms is it producing, which we don't see, which are obscured. I think that's often one of my concerns is that if we want AI literacy to be successful, it has to kind of unpack these systems, think about the whole wider ecosystem, rather than just look at the results and hey, that's great, that's really helped me. So when I think about AI literacy, I think you've got to unpack the whole pipeline of AI.
Yeah, and I think it's a lovely way to end, and it just makes me reflect on this point that we mentioned it earlier on, but this idea that artificial intelligence is to an extent a reflection of us as humans and what we value and what we see as important, almost reaffirms what we're trying to do for our students, which is recognize that you're part of this discussion regardless of your home discipline, and actually you do all have something to contribute to this and help shape this in future. Thank you, Sanjay, so much. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining, and really looking forward to speaking to you another time. Thanks, Sanjay.
Great. It's great to be able to be part of the discussion.